I don't want to try to go into too long with the material today. It's mostly an introduction. Your homework, I think, does a good job of really just elaborating on your thought processes, and then I can try to take the time in the beginning of tomorrow to kind of reflect on that homework, and as well as it's moving forward with the next part of it. And so we're talking today about studies. Now, when we talk about samples find information on a variable or variables for a single population. In studies, we want to compare the responses for a variable between two or more populations / groups. Now, what's important here is that we have the same variable, and in studies we want to also do this big word right here is compare. So we're going to talk about what are we comparing. We might want to compare grades, for example, and so the variable would be grades. We might want to study the difference of grades between grade levels, where we can do courses. So math grades versus English grades, for example. We can do gender. We can do females and males and compare their grades. The variable itself is the same, but the groups are different. The populations are different in some very important way. Okay. Now, studies are sorry. Can you see? No, I knew I was losing. Internet down? Sorry about that. My internet went down. Just got back up. All right, I think I'm back. Can you hear me? Sorry about that. I think I'm back on. My internet had went down. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
All right. Thank you so much. I noticed right away. So studies. Studies are made from samples. All right. I put made from samples that determine the scope of the study. Okay. So they're comprised of the scope of the study. So basically what we're saying here is if the sample population is who we can expand our results to. For example, if my study includes only women 50 and plus, then the scope of the study is to women who are 50 years or older, who are 50 plus. So if my sample only includes those women who are 50 years and older, then my scope in terms of who I apply my results and my findings to, my findings can only be applied to women 50 years or older. If you do not have a random sample of the entire population, so for example, you can't say that this applies to men. Now, right now with the vaccine, very applicable right now. And we're going to talk about this a lot more tomorrow because we're going to talk about experiments and hopefully I can get into a lot more about what's going on with the vaccines and how their experiments and what they've tried to do. There's lots of applications, so I'm kind of excited. Maybe I'll even expand on that part. But some of the studies, sorry, they call them trials, but some of the studies did not include pregnant women, for example. So they don't know how pregnant women, for example, at least in one of the studies, will react to the vaccine. So if a pregnant woman, now it could be that everything turns out fine, but in the studies that they have been conducting around the vaccine and its side effects and its how effective it is, some of them, because it's very, there's no reason why to. I mean, it's very troubling that if something were to bad happen, you don't want that in your study with somebody who's pregnant and their child. So they weren't included in the study. So you can't expand. You can't say that the results that were true for everybody else that was in the study is also true for women or pregnant women. This was actually something that happened even more. So that's specifically with pregnant women, but in the past there was lots of medicines, there was lots of studies, anatomy, all these different things that basically in the past, being America that we are, in our history that we have to be acknowledgeable of some maybe travesties or misgivings of our history. A lot of the studies in the back days were only white males. So the scope of the studies in terms of who you can really apply the results to were white males. And, so females, react differently, be it the age groups that were being selected for these white males. If you were in that population, then you could take a lot, everything pretty much as the truth of what was saying in these studies. But if you were not, well, in most cases, it still may be applied to you. The results of the study cannot be applied scientifically to you since you were not in the scope of the study. All right, so scope of the study, the sample population, so it's who that sample is taken from. Now, of course, if we don't have a random sample, all right, then there's bias in that sample, like you only chose healthy males, all right, so it has to be known that your study only included healthy males. So there needs to be this idea behind randomization. So randomization is important behind the scope of the study. So, next piece. When talking about this word studies, there are two main categories of studies that we're going to cover. And we're going to be focusing on the left one today. And these are called observational studies. This is what we are going to focus our homework on as well today. But we also will know about what's the difference between an observational study and experimental studies. Now, of course, we sometimes just call these experiments. Experiments are studies. The goal is to compare. All right? Compare how people react to COVID-19 with the vaccine versus people who how people react to COVID-19 that don't take the vaccine. That's a lot of what has been going on. So there was a comparison and there was an experiment. And I'll talk about what makes one versus the other. What makes something an observational study versus an experimental study. I will talk about that really quick, very soon. In regards to observational studies, there are two types of observational studies. There is a retroactive observational study, and there is a prospective observational study. I will define these in a little bit. So in your homework, it's going to say, what type of study is this? First off, you have to determine if it's observational or experimental. Spoiler alert, I guess you can determine if something's an experiment in your homework tonight. But if you have to go into more detail, it's not going to be an experiment because I'm only going to give you enough information to go into detail for an observational study. In an experiment, there are three major types of experiments. There's a completely randomized experiment. This is very similar to a simple random sample. There's what we refer to as a blocked experiment. This is very much similar to stratified. And then there is what we refer to as matched pairs experiment. So in our course, we want to be able to identify between all of these, and this is towards later on, there are two types of matched pairs. There's self-control and there's similar group. I know this is a lot, but I just want to put this flow chart up on here because today, this is all we're focusing on today. All right, we're just focusing on these observational, retroactive, and prospective studies. What are they, and so forth. Okay. Maybe you guys know this information, so I'm just going to check. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. What makes something an experiment? You know, maybe you've done these in your physics or science courses. What makes something an experiment? Do you have any idea? Any inclinations? Any thoughts?
It's data.
They both have data, so they both have data. They're good thoughts. They both have data. Variables. Okay, so they both have variables. We're getting closer though. Yes, there's something about the variables though. So I do want to note that first and foremost, because these are perfectly stated, and I actually want to include them in my notes. Both studies, I keep saying students every single time. Both studies gather data on a variable. All right, and more importantly, it's a categorical variable, or sorry, on a variable. Both compare with against populations. And the populations are determined by a categorical variable difference. So the question here is then, how do they do? So here's the answer. In an experiment, the groups slash differences are assigned slash manipulated. Observational studies have differences that are not manipulated, happen or happened naturally. So the big difference here is that in the whole word is this word about manipulated. So in an experiment, we manipulate, we assign which group you are in, and we are able to do that. We are able, so for example, if I wanted to compare the differences between males and females, okay, ethically speaking, a lot of this is ethical. Am I going to be doing an observational study or an experiment?
Observational.
Observational. Why?
I mean, mostly because you can look to compare and contrast, I guess.
No. Why is it an experimental? Why is it not an experiment? I'm comparing males against females. Whatever I'm trying to I'm comparing um, you know, heights of males versus females. Why is this an observational study and not an experiment? Correct, it's going to be an observational study. The answer here is because you can't assign who's male and who's female. All right, when you collect the data, they are automatically going to be considered male or female. You don't get to choose. Alexandra comes up and I can't go, Alexandra, you're a male. Amy, you're a male. Z, you're a female. I don't pick that for you. I don't make you a male or I make you a female. You come in naturally when you're included in my data. You are what you are. There is no manipulation. You already do what you do. You already are what you are. As the person running the study, I do not get to choose that. Okay? In an experiment, there is something that is going to be manipulated. So for example, there's a lot of different things. So, and here, well, let me actually follow up with this before I move on. Because there's a very important um, fallout of this. Experiments can prove results of comparison when done correctly. Where there's such things as bad experiments, okay? Observational studies never prove, only show relationship. So remember we were talking about those ideas earlier on in the course about is there a relationship or not, and we looked at the data, but there's actually a much more better way of doing it here. So this happened a lot. For example, there was lots of studies about the effects of smoking. All right, there were lots and lots of studies about how smoking causes cancer, lung cancer, right? There's a lot of different studies that said, like, and for the most part, we know that smoking causes cancer, but we could never prove it. We can never prove it. And in courts, and when you go there, you have to prove, right? If you go to courts, you had to prove. And the reason why is because of all the studies that were done, all of the studies were observational studies. Okay? And when we have an observational study, the idea is that you didn't select, you don't get to manipulate who is a smoker. This person has been smoking for 30 years. Okay. Did you make that person smoke for 30 years? Did they have the option, or did they were a smoker? All right. Because when you collected the data, they were already smoking for 30 years versus somebody who doesn't smoke, right? They're all observational studies. And because when they're observational studies, you can't prove. So these people who smoked are more likely to suffer and die from lung cancer, right? And we had that, but that's a relationship. As we understood, we have this idea behind lurking variables. Because it's a study. Well, this person was also, if they're choosing to smoke, you can put holes into all the stuff and say, well, it doesn't prove anything. Just because these people are more often have lung cancer that are smokers doesn't mean that they are smokers, or that is exactly what caused it. There could be a lot of other choices in their life or a lot of other things around them that can't be accounted for. And so for years and years and years, there was these things that can cause, and they had to put a label, but they were never like proven that smoking and cigarettes cause lung cancer. Because it wasn't an experiment. In order to do an experiment, you would have to say, well, that you're going to randomly select, and there's random assignment, we'll talk about that a lot tomorrow, between who smokes and who doesn't smoke. This person is randomly going to be assigned to be a smoker, and this person is randomly going to be assigned to be a non-smoker. You can't force that. You could say think that there was a lot of arguments made from maybe not scientists, but statisticians saying, well, those individuals who chose to smoke also choose more likely to do other things that can cancer. And not everybody who got cancer was a smoker. Some people still had lung cancer who weren't smokers. So the big idea here is that an experiment can prove. Yes, this proves. However, in an observational study, you cannot say the word prove. It shows a relationship. It does not prove. Okay? So the observational studies. we have retrospective. The differences in the groups occur before the samples are selected. So retro, old, right? It's already happened. Retro, already happened. So think of it this way: the example I just talked about with the smokers. Well, we can actually do it right now with the vaccine. Let me pivot right now to our vaccine. If we were going to do the a retrospective study on vaccines in regards to COVID-19, okay? Is this a retroactive or can somebody explain to me how it can be a retroactive? Or what does it mean to be retroactive in regards to COVID-19? Anybody have a guess? Retroactive, I'm going to collect data on people who have COVID-19 for my vaccine study. If it's retroactive, what would I say? What does it mean that when I collect that sample, these people were selected to be in my sample, to be in my study. If it's retroactive, what do we, and we're talking about COVID-19, exposure to COVID-19. Okay, how about that? Exposure. We're going to see if they get COVID-19 or not. And the question is, we're going to compare those who have been exposed versus those who have not been exposed for different periods of time. Anybody have a guess? Just use the word. So the difference is exposure to COVID-19.
What exactly are you asking, Mr.?
So in a retrospective study for this, what would it mean? So about exposure to COVID-19. So they were exposed to the virus. So in a retrospective study, and let me just go forward then. Those in a already were exposed or not exposed to the virus. So when you selected these individuals for your study, they already were exposed or they weren't exposed. So we're going to collect data we're going to collect blood samples, right? And when we collect those blood samples, or when we collect that, and we're going to analyze those results now. We're going to collect the blood samples and we're going to run the test now. This is a retrospective study because they have already, you're going to determine if they already have been exposed or not. So when you collect the data, when you select them, they were already exposed or not exposed. That's a retrospective study. It already occurred. The difference already occurred. In a prospective study, what do you think a prospective study is then? The difference is I don't know why I have in the in the groups occur what? Retrospective is before. Prospective is
After.
after. Samples selected. I.e., you select who is in the study, collect the data, and then determine over time who gets exposed and not. So basically in here, you would select, for example, everybody has not been exposed. So you would select everybody who has not been exposed to COVID-19, for example. Your sample might be also choosing from those who've never had it and have not been exposed to it. They are selected. So I select 100 different people who are going to be in my study. And after I've already selected these people, then over time, I'm going to collect my data, and then I'm going to find out over the next 6 months who has been exposed and who has not been exposed. Okay, and I might do like data in terms of whatever I'm trying to do my variable. It could be like, white blood cell counts, something like that. I don't know. I don't even know if that applies. But the idea here is that the two different groups that you're comparing has the difference between them already occurred. If you manipulate it, so if you manipulate it, that's an experiment. If it has already happened, that is a retrospective. If it hasn't yet happened, then that is a prospective. A good example is so an idea is MCAS scores. MCAS scores and current grade and college acceptances. So if my sample is ninth graders, this is my response variable right here. If they get accepted or not accepted. If my sample is ninth graders, and it's, let me just, 10th grade MCAS scores, is this going to be a retroactive or prospective study? I'm going to break them up in those who, for example, those who pass the MCAS and those who fail. I want to compare those who pass versus those who fail. And my sample is, I'm going to sample ninth graders. I'm going to select them when they're in the ninth grade. Would this be a prospective study or a retrospective study?
Is it proactive or prospective?
Prospective. And the reason it's prospective is because they have not taken MCAS yet. My sample is 12th graders. I sampled 12th graders, and then I'm going to compare their college acceptances. Is this prospective or retrospective? It's kind of obvious. One of one's prospective, the other one's going to be
Retrospective.
Retrospective. And the reason is that the students have already taken the MCAS. So what's differing from these two groups is if they've taken, it's how they did on the MCAS. How they did on the MCAS, those who passed the MCAS versus those who failed the MCAS and their college acceptances. That's the response variable. And so if I select them in the 9th grade and I follow them, this is a prospective study because they have not yet taken the MCAS. If I select them and they've already taken it, then this is called a retrospective because the result of the differences between the MCAS scores is it's already occurred. Okay. I wanted to note this right here. Sorry. A prospective is a better than retrospective. However, so a prospective study is better. It's better to collect the data, like for example, it's better to select two in the 9th grade because then there's all these other type of things. Did they drop out of school? Did they, because did some other life instances happen that we can find out? So we can find out more information from a prospective study than we can from a retrospective study. Now, when I said these differences, so I talked about these two variables, okay? And so the last thing I have for my notes is that we are going to compare a variable. This is called the response variable. And there are differences in groups. This is called the explanatory variable. So we have two variables. We have the explanatory variable. What are we trying to make explain? And we did this when we were talking about bivariate data. And then we have the response variable. So they have different explanatory to compare the same response. That's what we have for studies. Be safe. Your homework has been posted. Most of the homework, some of the homework is this. Is this an experiment or is this an observational study? Is it prospective? Is it observational? And then there's some other questions. There's a questions, for example, that just say like, how much should you believe in your results? Well, if it's an observational study, not much because there was no manipulation, only an experiment. So there's always that, or you'll see that question, and you'll say like I just said, how much should you believe in your results? Not much because it's an observational study. It only shows a relationship, doesn't prove. If it's retrospective or prospective, what is the scope of it? I'm going to check the homework again real quick. I might update it and try to take something off. I'm going to double check to make sure that it isn't too long. I mean, I did the homework in less than 1 page, so it shouldn't be too bad. Beyond that, I'm going to end class now. Stay safe. There's a lot of snow coming in. So if you need to go do any errands, get them done. But as such, be safe while you're out there. Tomorrow would have